This is going to be the first of 4 sessions I'm running at FESPA, and this is about fabric printing, and it's the fabric tech time, as it's called. I did cheat a bit. I've got some pre-written questions, but I'm hoping we will wander off the beaten track a little. First of all, I'd like to introduce you to my panellists. We've only got one microphone, so they can only talk individually. Could you just tell us a little bit briefly about you, Max?
I'm Max Durhack. I'm a principal scientist with Onyx Graphics. Been there for 24 years, working on a degree in color science.
Stephen Hood. I'm Managing Director of ESP Technologies Group, based in the UK. We're 95% a digital printer now. We had screen printing roots, and 2 years ago we made our first investment in textile digital printing.
My name is Roland Biemans. I'm the Marketing Director of Key & Digital. We produce inks for sublimation, specifically on textiles.
Okay, so we've got sort of different technology experience, I think we could say, in the carefully hand-picked panelists. I'm going to start straight off with a question. Actually, I'm going to start this one because I know it's dear to Stephen's heart, and we'll try and keep it organised and behave ourselves if we can, but when I sit next to Roland, anything could happen. So Stephen, the first question is, why hasn't dye sublimation taken off in the UK? And then you can join in, how is it thriving in other parts of Europe and in fact in other parts of the world?
Well, this is my question to Sophie, and I find myself sitting here talking about the answer. Obviously, we've thought about it a lot. Before we made the investment in fabric printing technology, it was obvious to us that this was a sector that we couldn't address and should be, based on what was happening in Europe and progress with environmentally conscious printing. This was a step that we should make. Now, ESP specialise in very large format printing, predominantly for exhibition market or museum markets, although we do some small elements in point of sale. But everything is basically large. So I can't speak for the textile market as a whole. And what we found is that clients love the look and feel of samples, but I would say there is a fear factor of changing. They shouldn't have a fear factor because they trust us. We might have been doing their graphics for 5 or 10 years, and if we say, why don't you try this? There is still a reluctance. So I would say it is just an inbuilt fear of change. And I'm not going to say the British have a greater fear of change, but people will say this looks a better colour, it's lighter weight, no creasing, it's easier to handle, and yet they won't change.
Is there inherent difference in cost?
Not really. Obviously, having made an investment in a technology, our prices in charging for bringing something new are not at the bottom end of the range. But it's not a price issue, I would say.
Roland, what do you think? Because you've obviously come from a fabric printing background recently.
Yeah, my background is in digital textile printing. I've been selling equipment to the digital textile arena for many years. What we found is that a lot of people are in fact scared because they know a single process where they print directly onto a material and that's it. But if you do textile printing, then there's the sublimation involved. If you have a sublimation ink or a dispersed direct ink, you print onto the textile and then you have a second step. And people most of the time perceive that as something difficult. Then they think the price is going to be higher, but in fact it may not be that case because you win it back in the end. So why didn't it take off in the UK specifically? I think that there's a different sales strategy, and I think that there's a mainland difference. I already said this before, not because the British drive on the wrong side of the road, but in crossing borders and in getting stuff up there, some of the cost is in transport. Some of the cost is in getting stuff from, say, the Netherlands to Austria or from France into the UK. So there's an inherent cost that may scare people off as well.
I think you're very brave actually saying that because you've got somebody British on both sides of you.
I don't care.
And I don't know, you really think that that bit of distance is an affected...
There's another thing is that, and maybe it's even more so, is that people are scared of the stuff they don't know.
Yeah.
So first you have to show people, if you see how rapidly the textile printing for frames in Germany took off, that was really fast. So the backlids, the edge framed with the silicone strips, that was something here in Germany that just lifted off really fast. And then you see that it happens a little later in the UK because it was an unknown thing.
But also, I mean, the Germans traditionally have a very good method of, or a mind that will put a system together rather than just a piece of a job and a piece of a job. Do you think that's made a difference? Because there have been some fantastic integrated systems where the actual part of the textile print is, the frame is a part of it.
Yeah, but I don't know if that is an UK specific problem, why it shouldn't have taken off there.
Let's ask Max's view on this, if you've got one.
I really don't have a view on this one.
Because he's not from around.
No, we know. But what about, do you think it's people are worried about the colour?
Actually, that could be an aspect of it, because the thing about it is the color will look different, because you're not going to get as rich, dark colors potentially. It's not going to necessarily. It has a different look to it. It's kind of got a nice fabric sheen to it as opposed to a glossy print, But I think it has huge advantages over other means. I mean, it's very lightweight. You can clean it. You can ship it much easier. There's a lot of advantages, but it does require a different way of installing things, and it requires a different way of maintaining it. So you have to potentially retool and retrain the people who are actually involved with putting it up and doing it. It's not, you can't just do the same things you did before.
You wanting to add something?
I'm going to add the
Please,
obvious,
go on.
which is the weather.
Oh, no, yeah, that's an interesting one.
I mean, we don't have a monopoly on rain, but we have perhaps more than some others. But I wonder, if you go to southern Europe, you'll see brighter fabrics and you'll see more fabric printing. I mean, Great Britain's stuck halfway up on the left-hand side. I don't know what the position is in Scandinavia because I don't have any experience, but I wonder whether wetness has something to do with this, because the outdoor advertising market, which is a strong user of large format graphics, will be reluctant with the rain.
That's actually something I hadn't really thought much about. It's almost leading us on into the next question, which is, what do you consider to be the greatest challenges to printing on textiles in the display industry? And maybe the weather is one of them, particularly in Britain. Roland?
Yeah. Yes. No, there's a very big difference if you look at the weather, the influences of the sun, but also the rain. If you see, let's look at a flag. If a flag is hanging somewhere in the city, it will last longer most of the times than when it is at the seaside. So if you're in an environment where there's a lot of influence from outside, people will have that as one of the things. The light fastness properties is one of the things that gets back to you always. Because light fastness, the influence of sun onto your textiles, makes that you have to make a choice of a different type of ink. So if you take a sublimation ink that is less strong as the UV fastness properties you want to have as a disperse, then that is a change. And if you have to set up a system where you have to pick an either or, so either you do sublimation or you do the disperse direct, then you're going to limit yourself. You have to think about that. So one of the factors may be that people getting scared out of having more questions about what type of ink would I be using then.
Max, do you want to add something to this?
I think that there's a difference between indoor and outdoor things, and I think the outdoor has the greater challenges. And in all actuality, I mean, for flags and banners, you know, the things that are flooding, those are nice because they move and they catch your attention. That's not something you're going to do with, you know, vinyl or that, you know, and it's a perfect application for that. But for doing, you know, billboards and bus wraps and things like that, the fabric's not going to necessarily do it. It's just not necessarily made for that. So I think that the applications, what you really end up having is you end up having divergent applications where one is more suitable than another. But in terms of an indoor display, I think that the fabric has great opportunities, you know, because you don't necessarily need to worry about UV, you don't need to worry about the weather. The real question of it is there a difference between the regions in terms of what sort of things are being done inside in terms of displays and stuff like that, in terms of the interior design and how those spaces work in terms of those cultures.
Well, there's a lot of other benefits inside too. There's no odour, there are no VOCs, there's no HAZCHEMs, there's a lot of benefits that I still don't think people realise.
Yeah, I mean, I was at a site last week, and you know, I saw a producer, you know, and they put the frames and put the wall, and they did the wall. It's like, wow, you could, rather than doing wallpaper or painting, I could just put the textile, you know, and I could change my indoor feel of my house, you know, quarterly or whatever I really wanted to, very easily, very simply, and you know, just like having, you know, a covering you put on the table for Christmas or whatever. You could have different coverings for your walls for different events.
See, one of the dangers I've always found with display print as well is that people will insist on longer and longer life durability and forget the quick change capabilities and possibilities with digital. And that's very true in textile as well. Nothing is forever, particularly a digital print, or it shouldn't be anyway.
Yeah, and you don't necessarily have to be very, very talented to be able to change it. You you just have a step ladder and poke it in, and you can set it up. I mean, they actually do it for in store displays. They're doing it now quite often in various markets, and you know, they basically ship it out to the thing, and the salespeople put it up, you know, before the store opens.
I mean, that just underlines my question about why customers don't see the benefits. I mean, in the UK, in the retail sector, they're obsessed with throwing self-adhesive vinyl on the walls at night in a retail environment, rather than, as you say, there are now some very sexy systems which would enable you, hurrah, to change graphics regularly and easily without necessarily having great skills.
And you can reuse it too, you know, from season to season. You can go back. You can potentially reuse it too because it's washable, right? You know, you put it up and then you put it, store it where you need to, and then put it up next season or whatever.
So do you think that when you say people aren't aware of it, you know, how are they going to find out? And we've had this actually with different ink technologies. Is it the agencies? Is it the brands? Who is it that needs to try and educate? Because we can only do a certain amount from where we're sitting.
I mean, of course, there's two questions to answer, really. One is why a printing company such as ourselves would choose to go into textile printing, and then how we would choose which version of fabric printing, but more importantly is the demand-led customer side. And I think you've touched on a good point that the brand owners, sort of top down, is where perhaps we need some direct education in what is possible. And I'm coming back to my people frightened of change. And it's much easier if you're a print solutions provider, if you're invited to provide a fabric solution, rather than if you offer up the standard solution and you say the fabric one, that's less powerful than if it's come from the top down.
And you can't use environmental benefits and stuff like that.
We use that, but those environmental benefits would come with a stronger voice if they came from brand owners down, I think.
Now, the only bit where I see actually brand owners getting involved at the moment is to do with packaging, because that's consumer-led. We don't have the same thing, obviously, with anything to do with textile printing. It's not the consumer that ultimately dictates what they want to do about their environmental policies and recycling. Roland, have you got some thoughts on this? You're sitting grunting next to me.
Not
Go
really
on.
grunting, but what we see happening now, I made the change to Key and Digital just recently, and I spoke with a lot of people where I asked, why would you use that type of ink, or why would you choose that type of textile? Where you see now that there are, in fact, big groups of specifiers that will say, if you start to produce for us, then it has to be with that certification in place. So either Oecotex or Indutex, or there's Clear to Wear. There's mostly in the fashion, when you have sportswear, fashion, swimwear, where they would just plainly say to the print producer, it has to be within the norms that we set. So the specifier tells the producer what they can or cannot use. Else there's no deal, there's no sales, there is no production. Similarly is that in the, not particularly the retail environment, but if you go to flags and banners, there's an increasing amount of people saying we want to have a green product inside of our stores. We no longer want to use a solvent or a UV, but we want to have a textile that is healthy. So would you put something on your wall if it is potentially harmful for you? So there are a couple of drivers here that allow the bigger success for textile.
I mean, still on the same theme, I mean, we're aware of a number of brands where it's not just consumer-led, it is where the ethical, environmental aspect is an important part of the brand. So, obviously no names, because that excludes others, but perhaps a company like IKEA will specify that this is a high priority in their choice of supplier, and when they come to make decisions about placing an order. However, price has also its very important part to play. As a high-quality print provider, we say, no, let's not talk about price, let's just talk about quality and service, and that's obviously the sweet spot for us. But the reality, particularly over the last few years, has been that people have had very serious price pressures, and just at the time that we've all become much more environmentally aware, and I think fabric does offer the best way forward against the standard solutions for the last few years. Prices and the recessions have come at a bad time.
I'm going to, because this actually takes us into the question after next, so I'm going to ignore the next question now, because, you know, one of the questions was, you know, how can textile print compete favourably against other ink technologies? And it kind of sounds like it can't, but it should be able to. So how can we address it?
Well, it should do on, if one can set some objective criteria. Price can be an objective criteria, it's an overriding criteria, and it kicks out the long-term green aspects, although, as you say, the benefits of reusing are very strong with fabrics, and yet, as far as I can see, there's still a lot of resistance.
What do you think, Max?
Well, I was just thinking that with the textile, if you have to put up a frame, that's a challenge because you're not just plastering something on the wall, which is something that they're simple. You potentially have to have an installation process to begin with, but once you have that, then it's very simple and very easy to use. And I think in the long term, that provides many more benefits. That's all I can say.
Do you see we've also got sort of more diverse markets coming online now, like interior decor and wall coverings and
Actually,
this is
I
rhetoric,
think
this question,
that
I'm
as
afraid.
interior decorators get an idea of this, they'll find ways of using it because it may be that the interior design of whatever place space that you have, it can change and change with lighting and with textile much easier at a much lower cost, I think.
What do you think, Roland? Let's have your thoughts.
What we've seen in the past is where we did a lot of application examples that all of a sudden people noticed, so specifiers, end customers, print producers, they've seen that you can make pillows, you can make bedspreads, you can do your upholstery, you can do your wall coverings. There are so many applications that people sort of disregard at first because they haven't seen it before. So at some point they'll see that there's something in addition, you have something extra. I think it's really important to, like here at FESPA, is that you see a lot of application examples where people would then come in and say, right, I didn't think of that this was a possibility. Because you can do something silly like lampshades. It's very easy to produce and it makes it really personal to your taste. If you look at a textile from a curtain, or it could even be, what's it called, the sunshade things that you turn the window blinds. If you look at that could also be a textile. So first, if you show what the possibilities are, then add that with some of the design, then all of a sudden people say, that is what I'd like to use.
Don't you think at the moment, I've noticed that HP obviously is pushing what it calls temporary textile with its new latex printers. Isn't that going to be good for the proper, as I call it, the proper digital textile market? Because you can get something with a more, a tougher life, definitely, with greater durability.
The question is, what are the requirements? If you want to put something in your house and you want to sit on it, then it has to be a certain quality. It has to be that you get something that doesn't stain, that you can sit on day after day. And that's a different requirement than putting a piece of art on your wall. The piece of art on your wall, you normally don't touch that much, or you don't do anything with it. So in those cases, you could get something that doesn't have that kind of rub fastness, for instance. In other cases, it is about the type of colors, because most people in interior want to have the light shades and the soft tones instead of the, well, like here, the really bright tones. That's not for everyone. So the requirements will then tell you what kind of process you're going to use, what type of ink you're going to use, what type of fabric you're going to use. So it depends on what you want to get out of that product. I'm not saying that one is worse than the other or one is better than the other. It has its own space. It's only a matter of showing what the capabilities are.
And what do you think on the colour question, Max? I mean, if you're working across all the different types of ink.
I think that I've seen a lot of textiles that are really bright. I mean, if you know what you're looking at and you know what the limitations are, it's beautiful stuff, and it gets the message across, and it's great and very useful in many ways. it's really just a matter of, I guess, the expectations that people have going into it. Ultimately, I think that really, as interior designers and graphic designers who are designing spaces or designing, you know, things that we use in our life, that they'll find that being able to do digital reproduction and personalizing or custom fitting or even basically doing something individual where I can potentially, you know, print something out and then I can sew it myself, and so I can get something specific for me very easily that you can't do with conventional technologies now.
Anything else to add on that, Stephen?
Well, I was going to go back to the question,
Go on.
really, which is,
Go on.
I mean, have you seen any inherent difference in colour management with digital textiles?
It's funny, I was just about to ask the same thing.
Well, you know, in all actuality, I'd say that the basic process you're going through with textile is essentially the same. There are some challenges. Textile is more likely to have fluorescence, which makes color management really difficult. But if you can basically, you know, work with color sets that have meaningful measurement, then the profiling process and the production process, it's more about process control in maintaining good color, because really basically slight variations in terms of the process of going from the print to the final output can dramatically change the color. And so that's really the real key, is process control becomes potentially more important to get, you know, predictable results. But the actual process, you know, within a RIP and that, it's essentially the same steps.
That is, of course, correct, and good housekeeping at all stages is the answer to many problems. And whilst to start with, for us as a print producer, yes, here we are going into a new technology, and there's a whole new learning curve with a different set of substrates, a different set of inks, a different finishing process. So for a print producer, yes, there's a whole lot of interesting challenges, which are important to overcome. But at the end of that, we are able to offer our customers a much wider choice of options, and we can try to lead them with the different benefits and the different options that are available. That's all we can do, is offer our customers options. As I say, it would be nice if there was some support from brand owners downwards.
Well, it's the encouragement, isn't it, just to get people to make the change. I mean, how many people that come and say, I want something printed for some indoor displays, how many actually go for textile over UV curable or even solvent?
Most of our customers wouldn't care how we produced it, basically.
Yeah, that's my argument, that one, normally, or my answer.
And why should they?
But textile feels very different to a different ink technology, whether it's solvent or UV curable. You'd know it was textile by just the way it looks and touches.
Yes, but if I stick to the UK, and it's a circular argument, people seeing their brand represented on a fabric are not used to seeing that soft touch here, and it is softer. It is different.
Do you think
I would say it's nicer because it's not glossy, but that's a personal preference. If you ask a customer, they would say, I want bright and glossy. I would say, well, that's going to mess around with your lights and reflection, and actually it's going to detract. But actually they're the customer and they make the choice, and they go for glossy mostly.
That's a strange thing because we in Britain do like our glossy finishes, and I can't think why. It was the same with photo papers.
I mean, I mustn't go off the subject, but if you look at hoarding graphics, of which there's millions around the UK now, and they're all with high gloss polyester anti-graffiti, and they look hideous because they reflect. You can get satin and matte anti-graffitis. They cost more, and they are twice as good. So I really refute. But the customer is the boss.
What do you think, Roland? Go on, you've got something to say on this, I'm sure.
Well, I can say
Watch you stewing there.
a couple of things, of which some of it is not really appropriate for here now. But
See him in the bar afterwards.
color-wise, it's the perception, it's the expectation, where you sometimes again have to show that a textile can look really nice. You can do a backlit, or you can do a framing system where people would say, this looks actually quite nice. It doesn't have that gloss, but it's still very beautiful. In your case, I know that you produce really deep blacks and you produce real nice colors, and that is buying into sort of the what people want to get out of it. They see that type of quality, they see that you make it happen, and then they get convinced about, okay, this is a different type of quality, but it's still a quality. It may not be what I wanted to get in the first place, but you've shown me that there's something different. If you're then able, like what you say, in hitting the color, so if you have to do a retail color because you want to have a logo, and you can reach exactly that color without the gloss and the shine, and it is exactly that Coca-Cola red or Deutsche Post yellow, or then you are in a place where people would look at it and say, well, that is exactly what I want. So from both the color perspective as well as on the expectations, yes, there's some education to be done, but there's a lot of people that are open enough to look at that and say, let's do the other thing. Then most of the times gets back to price. But if you can then turn it around into the value of things, then you can discuss value and quality. Quality being the color, color being the right color. So that type of quality.
Okay, so we finished on that particular topic because I've got another one which I haven't written down really, but it's kind of coming into my mind as we're talking about other things, and that really is the importance of the machine that you're using and the understanding of the manufacturer about the differences and the logic of taking a UV curable printer and changing a few bits and pieces and shoving dispersing through it. Do you think that's one of the reasons why people don't want to go into textile printing, because it's a compromise? Go on, Roland, this is near your heart.
Yeah, this is really close to my heart, because a process has to fit what you're doing, and just turning something into something that should be doing something else doesn't work. So if you want to go textile and you take a machine that's essentially built for printing on paper, then that will not work. You have to look at the total process. If you look at textile printing, it's the media, it's the coating, it's the amount of ink you lay on the media. If you want to do flags, you have to have print through. So the machine has to be turned into something that will allow you to reach that print through. If you want to have the colors to stay on top, then you have to get a media with probably a coating that keeps it up there. So a machine has to be built from the ground up, specifically for textile, to do what it is intended to do, else you're not going to get the results. There are so many cases where people say, I want to print on textile, they just take a printer, and because some sales guy said, yeah, we can do textile, that in the end they are being confronted with a lot of problems. Bleeding, they lose a lot of material. In the end, it's more expensive to run that whole thing. They throw away much more. and then they start talking price because of problems, and then we talk about, yeah, the ink is too expensive because it's 80 euros a liter, but if you then do the recalculation, it's not the cost per square meter in the ink, but it is the cost of your wastage because the machine wasn't built to print on textile in the first place.
Wow. Stephen?
Well, of course, Roland is correct. He's always correct. And he's correctly come from first principles. However, in the real world, people don't always come from first principles, and they don't always follow through logically. But he is right that, which just reflects our experience, you do have to match all of the elements from the substrate through the machine to the particular requirements of that process. And the easy, quick fix compromise of stuff a different set of inks through, but you then put a stretchy polyester fabric through this print machine, which actually has a completely different set of characteristics, yes, you're going to have problems. So as the industry has, as the digital textile printing industry is developing, there are a number of manufacturers who have perhaps not come from first principles and have made mistakes. I did tell a small white lie when I said that our first
Yes, I thought
foray,
you did.
it was only a small one, our foray into digital textile printing was only 2.5 years ago. We did have a very brief, frightening foray 5 years ago, and I just can't mention it, but it was one of those, somebody woke up one morning and said, why don't we stuff this on and we'll stick a heater on the end and we'll chuck it through and it'll come out the end as a fabric print. Well, yes, it did, but every meter, the colour was different, which was nothing to do with colour management.
No, I've got the photographic
It was process
evidence.
control.
Yeah. I've got the photographic evidence still. Yeah. So you'll have to be nice to me. Max, what do you think? Is this an area that you appreciate?
I have a question for actually these guys.
Go on then.
Related to this, because both of you have been talking about printing directly on the media with coating, but they also have a transfer process too as well. And my understanding is with transfer process, you potentially get a much crisper image as a result versus doing it. Now, you can refute that if you want, but the real question I have is in terms of sublimation, there's multiple modalities, and if you're printing on paper or transfer paper, in terms of the printing, the technology doesn't necessarily need to change because you are printing on paper initially first.
Go on, Roland.
There is a difference between dye sublimation transfer printing and, for instance, direct printing. It isn't necessarily so, this is a misconception, that you always get crisper images out of transfer. The single or maybe 2 or 3 manufacturers that have built a printer to be specifically on textile manages to get really crisp, nice images that would be able to be in comparison with the transfer alternatives. There aren't many of those because it's not a transferred system. It's a system that's built to do that exactly. But in general, if you look at the machines that didn't or weren't made for that purpose, then transfer printing is in fact giving you those benefits. So if you do a dye sub onto a paper, then do the transfer stuff, from a color management perspective, it's a little easier because you put the ink on the paper where you do the profiling. And it is not always the case that you have to...
Excuse me.
Yeah, no, I'm going to give you the microphone.
With him.
No, because I know we're going to get in an argument.
Go on then.
Because a large portion of the direct printing makes it complex because you look at the density. If you go for a flag, you don't want to change the color, but you do want to change the density. So you want to have more volume of ink on that print, but you don't really want to change the colors of it. Whereas if you go into your transfer mode, you have your advantages where you do your color management on the paper, and less on the side of the textile itself. Also for the crispness, if you have that printer where you want to maintain that crispness, even if you want to increase that volume because it's a flag, if you have a machine that caters for sucking it down or keeping it in place with or without coating, then you are at the right spot. Unfortunately, most of the printers are not built to do that. And that's why there's a lot of people saying that sublimation is that different from transfer, but it's also a piece of knowledge of what your kit can do.
Now, can you remember what it was you were going to argue with him about?
my real argument, we said that color management's on the paper, and I would argue that you don't want to do that. You really want to color manage the final result, regardless of whether you do transfer or not. So I do agree that, you know, how things are getting into the media is different between transfer and that. You may not necessarily be able to do in the transfer to get it all the way through the media is easy. So there are those differences there.
Is that it?
No, because I already knew that what you were going to say about color management
Can
would
you
be more in place.
Take the microphone back.
I was hoping that you would go into the conversation about color management, the differences between going to a transfer paper and the direct kind, because in the end it's about hitting the right color. And the type of paper that you're using, is it a light coated paper or is it a heavy coated paper? Is it a thin paper? Is it a thick paper? What kind of ink is it? It all makes it a little difficult. So I was hoping that you would get into the differences between the two types of processes from a color management perspective.
Well, I mean, to me, in terms of a color management, ultimately I'm color managing the final result, and how you get there is not necessarily entirely important. However, you know, the real question with transfer paper versus media is it easier or harder to get good process control on coating paper, which is a flat surface, or coating a fabric, which is not. So, you know, if for me, it doesn't really matter which way you go. Both are very viable. In the end, you're going to print things out. You're going to measure the results, and you're going to do some math to figure it out. The whole process of when we're talking about printers, printers can print with toner, printers can print with dye or pigment, and they can use bubble jet. They can use various printhead technologies. All of those technologies go into making the color, but from the color management point of view, it's what is the final result and how do you manipulate the input, which is really basically percentages or where dots are going. So that the intermediate process is for color management a black box in some aspects. In order to know what to do to manipulate at the very end, you got to have an idea of what the limitations and applications are of the intermediate process, but it's not necessarily the major concern. I'm
really glad you said that, because I knew he was wrong and you were right, but I didn't really want to say anything, because I'm sitting next to him and you're not.
Okay.
Have you got something to add on that, Stephen?
Well, that's made it quite easy, really, because we just have this standalone black box system on my right, which is dead easy and it's all self-contained. So that doesn't help any of us. Well, so now...
the real key, though, I think the real key is the different ways of going about it have different requirements related to the process control in order to get predictable results and the ultimate results. And they have their advantages and disadvantages. And that's really the thing to consider when you want to go one way or the other.
But if the end result is right, it doesn't really matter how you got there, whether it was good luck.
Well, for color management, we're assuming that you have a process that is repeatable and consistent.
Yeah.
And so the color management doesn't provide consistent, repeatable. And so process control is really the things that you need to do, the materials that you're using, the mechanisms you use to do that. And so there's variabilities in terms of coding or variabilities in terms of how printers lay down ink, and that's really the variability in terms of process control, but it's not necessarily a variability in terms of color management.
But you can take it right back to the drawing board and your screen, your computer screen. If that's not calibrated to start with, you could be in trouble. So, you've got to, if you've got to apply a standard anywhere down the workflow, it's got to be the end result, which obviously will help with the profiling and setting stuff up properly. But it's not a black art or a science. It's common sense, I think, and a lot of people just don't get that. Sorry, Stephen, you were going to...
I mean, Max is quite right to highlight the importance of process control far earlier down the line. And the only point I was going to make, because we were referring to the print machine and therefore the print manufacturer, and the question really is how well those manufacturers, which don't forget, they don't only give us a mechanical machine, they also give us an ink set with their own software. And as a printing company, we have no choice. We just have to use that. And the question is whether they have properly linked back to media, because the end result is dependent upon not just. I'm the guy in the middle here at this. In this, it's literally, and it's not just the print manufacturer. It's that link back to the substrate. So it is the complete process. And that seems to me the absolute most important consideration for building a sustainable market in digital fabric printing.
And also, if your colour management, if you can take one file and get the same colours on your UV curable printer and your textile printer and your eco-solvent printer,
Utopia.
then you've got a match, haven't you? You've got a result.
Yes.
I don't know if anybody here's got anything they'd like to ask these three as our last question. Oh, silence. They won't bite, they are really nice. No. So we've got time for one more quick question, which I shall ask then, and this is a kind of a machine one, you know what it is. Should you go inline fixation or keep it? When you buy your textile printer, should you go for an inline solution or should you buy a separate printer and a separate calendar?
My personal belief is you do not do inline fixation unless you know what you're doing, and most of the times the machines that are being built with inline fixation do not take into account all factors. And this is me putting it mildly, because fixation is a heat process. Fixation means that you want to have it in even flow, where the printing is a step by step. The print carriage goes back and forth. Sometimes you have to stop for a cleaning. What happens if you stop for a cleaning and your media is in your fixation unit? On top of the quality things is the economics behind it, because if you have a printer with an inline fixation and you want to get a second printer, do you need a second inline fixator? Economically speaking, you may want to have 3 printers and 1 fixation unit that can keep up with that speed, instead of having the whole long lead-in of your media. The media is a considerate portion of your cost. So if your lead-in and lead-out is 6 meters, and you have to do a change somewhere in a 100 meter roll, that means that depending on your width, you're going to throw away, say, 12 to 25 square meters on a roll. That's an economic benefit of going from a printer and then load it into something that fixates, instead of having it in one system. What if something goes wrong along the way? I would never do that. But that's because of my background, so I'm a little bit biased.
Yeah, I think we get how strongly you feel about this, Roland.
I put it
Bit of a
mildly.
naughty question for me, Stephen.
We gosh, as a business, probably 50% of what we produce, Matt, is roll-fed, 40% sheet-fed, and one of the advantages of roll-to-roll printing is, as Roland says, you've got a printing process which has its requirements for quality and control, and then you have a separate process which also has its requirements. And because we're dealing with roll-to-roll printing, the difficulty of not being in line is minimal, because it's very easy to transfer a roll. If we were dealing with handling sheets twice, I might take a different view. But I think the fact that we're dealing with roll-to-roll means you're right again, Roland.
Max, have you got any thoughts on this one to round off? Because we're
Well, I'm just going to say I totally agree with the things that have been said. I mean, if process control is your really key concern to get consistent results, it's much easier to get those consistent results when you separate the processes of printing and the process of fixing.
Well, it's like the print and cut argument, isn't it?
What?
It's like the print and cut argument, in a sense. You know, if you've got one machine that prints and cuts.
Well, and I've seen shops where
Yeah.
they actually have multiple printers
Yeah.
running a single
Yeah.
system
Yeah.
with the heat, and that works for them. I mean, you can grow without necessarily adding that extra cost.
But we're seeing an increase in people introducing complete inline fixation
Well, I
textile
think
printers.
the real difficulties they're going to have, though, is when they actually get to the customer sites and they're having a very difficult time getting good, consistent results with that. Because you've got that heater right next to the printer. You're going to have a whole lot more difficult time maintaining that heater being the right thing and maintaining the speed of things and stuff like that. It's just a huge challenge, and customers are going. If they get it right, then they'll have a set of customers that they think they got a one-step solution. But for a lot of people, I think that it's probably going to be separate.
Okay, well, I think we're almost out of time, unless you wanted to add something? No.
I'm good.
So, thank you, Roland Beemans, Stephen Hood, and Max, whose surname I've forgotten. I'm sorry, I've been saying Derhack. And I really appreciate the time that you've given up. And I hope you've enjoyed and learned a little bit from this afternoon's session. So thank you very much indeed.